Coming up on this week's episode of TechSNAP, Microsoft has just busted the Zeus botnet ring and seized their servers. We'll share the details with you. Duqu is still out in the wild, continues to evolve, and we've got new information. Plus, we'll bust Anonymous's overhyped, supposed Operation Global Blackout 2012 and why the internet won't be going down this weekend. All that and more in this week's episode, TechSNAP. Hi everyone, and welcome to TechSNAP. This is episode 51 of Jupiter Broadcasting's weekly Systems Network and Administration podcast. We streamed this one live on March 29th, just barely missing April 1st. My name is Chris, and joining me like every single week is the tech, the admin, and the teacher, Alan Jude. Hey there, Alan.
Hey, Chris.
Hey there, Alan. And I want to say that this episode is brought to you by GoDaddy.com, of course. Can't forget to mention them. We'll tell you a little more about them as the show goes on. And the live stream is provided by Alan's awesome ScaleEngine.com, which, is pretty epic. If you guys out there or want scaling or, infrastructure or, streaming, that kind of stuff, check it out. It's really cool. And that's what we use all the time. Our 24/7 stream over jblive.tv runs on that. Well, Alan, we have got probably too much of a show. This might be a really long episode if we slack off at all. But some pretty interesting stories, including some really groundbreaking stories in the roundup, stuff that I think is precedent setting, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Before we get rolling, I wanted to say congratulations. We have some of the folks actually in the IRC chat room right now, but the team behind our new show, Torqued. Torqued has launched. It's a new show over at Jupiter Broadcasting all about Star Wars: The Old Republic, which both Alan and I play. And this is a new show that is just hit episode 1 over at jupiterbroadcasting.com. It'll be a weekly show. It's live on Saturdays, and we're targeting for Thursday morning releases. And it's hopefully going to be one of the big Star Wars Old Republic shows. We'll see. But I'd love to invite you guys to check it out. Even if you're not a Star Wars Old Republic fan, if you're curious about the game and some of the big changes that are coming to it, go check that video out. Well, Alan, all right. That's all I really wanted to tell people before we got rolling on. Is there anything you'd like to cover, sir?
Nope. Ready to go.
All right. Let's talk about our first story, because it's an interesting one. It sounds like not only is Duqu I won't steal your thunder. Not only is Duqu still alive, but perhaps even evolving, and we've learned more about it. This seems like the story that just never ends, Alan. It's got a life of its own now. What's going on?
So basically, researchers, have noticed that Duqu is still evolving, and in February 2012, a new version of the driver was compiled and started being distributed.
Oh, nice.
So basically, one of the things they noticed is that Duqu is rather unique in that it basically appears to be a framework they use to build very specifically targeted malware for like an individual target, whereas normal malware is designed to hit as many people as possible, right?
Yeah, sure.
So Duqu seems to be, a reusable set of tools they can use, and then they add in modules and drivers to target one specific target. And because of this, and the data they have from the people that have actually seen Duqu in the world and so on, they believe that the number of victims that have been targeted by Duqu could be as few as 50.
Oh, wow. So talk about something that's generated a ton of news, a lot of discussion, and you're telling me...
It only went after 50 different targets, but, they're really big targets.
Yeah, well, and they're very specifically targeted, which is kind of a fascinating story. That tells you more right there. So... What do we know? What do we know more about now that we didn't know previously? Because I've seen like new bits and pieces coming out through the news, so I imagine you string some of it together.
There's a little bit, but so basically, recently they a new driver. So Duqu is basically a rootkit that is a Windows driver that's been fraudulently signed. So it even shows up as a signed driver. So basically, there's a new version of it called MCD9x86. .sys, and basically there's no new functionality in it, but it appears to be specifically designed to evade detection by the Crisis Lab tools that the Hungarian researchers that initially discovered Duqu wrote for detecting Duqu.
So they didn't really add any new features other than they just adjusted whatever they need to avoid detection.
Yeah, and also, even though there's new functionality, another reason why they might have compiled a new version of the driver is that the code signing certificate that they used to sign the old one was revoked because, they found out, hey, somebody hacked this code signing certificate and used it to sign a virus, so let's withdraw that certificate.
Now, somebody on our Reddit was, we have links.techsnap.tv where a lot of folks out there can submit stories and vote on stories for the show. And one of the submitters over there was saying, why don't all of these agencies just switch to Linux? And you and I have also made the comment before on the show, why don't they just unplug from the internet? Now, I would propose, Alan, I wanted to get your take on this. I would propose that while these are Windows-specific vectors that they are attacking, because of what you mentioned being only potentially 50 people have been infected with Duqu, it's so specifically targeted.
It's not specifically, yeah, so it would be companies rather than people. But yeah.
Right. But it's so specifically targeted, they could just as easily target Linux or a FreeBSD system or something like that. I mean, at that point, being Windows is almost irrelevant, don't you think?
Partly. You know, it's much harder to make a kernel driver rootkit type thing for Linux, but it is possible, yes.
Right. I mean, I would just think with the expertise that these people seem to have and the focus, I don't know. It might make a difference, but
you know, specifically if you're after like research and development type documents, that's mostly going to be like Microsoft Office documents sitting on a, you know. I
guess I would say it would probably decrease the attack surface.
The Duqu thing is more about gathering intelligence and so on than actually like targeting like the SCADA systems and so on that we've talked about. Because most of those aren't Windows. A lot of them have Windows control systems or you know, browser-based control systems with no authentication.
I guess you know what the core difference would be is that the open source-based systems have a more open bug tracking system where critical, like mission-critical industries that use that code could monitor those to know what their systems are vulnerable to, whereas with Windows, there could be a vulnerability that Microsoft just hasn't disclosed yet, or Microsoft doesn't know about because there's different processes to inform them about them. Whereas open source, the barrier to entry there to get a bug published and then fixed is not only lower, but also much more transparent.
Yeah. But, you know, Microsoft doesn't do too bad of a job of, you know, like we saw with that RDP vulnerability, they, you know, announce it and get the fix out.
Right,
Of course, you know, how long
very good.
Were they working on that fix before it came out where everything was vulnerable, right?
They are very good about it, but we only know what they let us know.
Right.
So if there's something that's worse...
most open source things have similar policies where, you know, they don't disclose it until they have the fix.
Right, true.
Unless there's something you can do to mitigate it, or if it's actively being exploited. So if a researcher finds something and reports it, then they keep that under wraps until they solve it, and then they announce it with the resolution. Now, if it's something that's actively being exploited, then yes, information about it gets opened up as soon as possible, and people try to come up with mitigation steps until a fix can be made.
Indeed.
Yeah.
All right, sir. Well, moving on. What else?
Where
was I?
Researchers were also found bits of code in there that they couldn't identify what language it had been written in.
Now, this is interesting.
So they basically, you know, after they tried a bit and gave up, they employed crowdsourcing. They were like, all right, let's just publish what we have and see if anybody else can identify it. And with the help of that crowdsourcing and the reverse engineering subreddit, they managed to identify the language that makes up some parts of Duqu as an object-oriented framework of C, which is, you know, a rather rare thing to see, because if you want object-oriented, you would normally just write C++ instead. And also that it seems that Duqu is being compiled with a version of Microsoft Visual Studio 2008 with a number of more esoteric compile options turned on.
Not to derail the train of thought too much, but the chat room picked up on it, and I kind of agree. Yay, Reddit. I mean, Reddit was unquestionably, for better or for worse, a massive voice in the SOPA battle and organizing all of that. And now Reddit's involved with...
Well, it wasn't Reddit itself. It was just the people that happened to be in the room.
I think they played a pretty significant role in generating the buzz and getting people to move on it, though.
Well, I mean, a lot of it started on the researchers' own mailing list, the secure list.
Oh, I'm not saying they were the source. I'm not saying that. They're not... You know, but and you don't really go to Reddit very much, so you probably didn't see it.
It's a news item, so it ended up on. It's like
it overtook Reddit. I mean, everywhere was all about SOPA all over Reddit. It was really quite an interesting.
But that's not what I'm talking about. This story, not SOPA.
I know, but my point is now Reddit's been involved in this story as well.
I'm saying that it wasn't Reddit, the site. It was the people on Reddit that did this.
I know.
Right?
Yeah, that's the thing. That's the whole. I mean, I find that. I think you and I had an off-air conversation the other day about Reddit, and I think this is a pretty significant impact Reddit's making.
Right, but the same impact could have happened on any discussion.
Yeah, but it's not, and it's happening here more and more.
It did happen on the original secure mailing list.
Right,
anyway,
but not at the scale it needs to.
And but it was only one person that figured it out. It's not. But anyway, crowdsourcing is good. As the open source axiom goes, with enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow.
Right. That's well said.
So, well, I didn't make that up.
Yeah.
Quote.
That's a good one.
But basically, yeah. So some of the people on the reverse engineering subreddit, somebody posted the details in there because that's what Reddit does. You post articles from other websites, and people started looking at it. And basically, they found that there's a specific OO framework whose compiled code seems to look the most like this. Although it seems that the framework wasn't released. The framework is newer than some of the code in Duqu.
Oh, really?
So it may not be the exact one, or it may be the same authors, or it depends.
Huh.
But also because of the fact that they were using an object-oriented framework on top of C rather than using something like C++ because basically it's more work to do it the way they did it. The researchers speculate that this means the authors of Duqu are older programmers that were brought up before C++ and like learned C and don't trust the abstraction of the memory management and so on in things like C++, and are just more comfortable writing regular C and then bolting an OO framework on top of that.
That's an interesting insight, isn't it?
Yeah. It doesn't. It's not. It's just an observation. But
yeah. Could be requirements of who wanted to make it or whatever. But that's interesting.
Yes. C is more portable than C++, but not by that much. And so in the end, it's it makes you wonder.
Is it old hackers putting this together?
Well, no. But is it people that may have been working at certain maybe government agency for a rather long time before they were trusted with this project or whatever?
Right.
Like we said, Duqu's been going on for quite a while as well.
And they've probably been writing stuff like this for a long time. So that same division that maybe has been creating this kind of stuff just got this highly important project or something. That's or maybe it's something else completely different. Who knows? Right.
But basically, the fact that Duqu's been going on for 5+ years, well, not Duqu itself, but the family of worms and so on has been going on that long means that, and
you want to work with something is good, So if you're going to start from something and it's been proven.
Like we speculated the other day with TechSNAP, when it used so many zero-day exploits, we wondered, did those come from something like VuPen, which we talked about the other week?
Right.
Did they just buy these from someone else, or did they find them themselves? Or is it a mix of the two?
Interesting. Yeah, that whole market where they can legally sell exploits like that. I think eventually it's got to come under fire. I think people are going to start cracking down on it eventually. It just doesn't seem like.
But when their only customers are governments, it's less likely that the government's going to crack down on it.
That's a good point. Yeah, that is a bit of a catch-22, isn't it? Because they're not going to make it illegal if they're the ones buying it. All right, Alan, anything else on that story?
Qui custodes ipso custodem.
This next story, I was sort of blown away by. I mean, it's a great story for this show. Are you ready to jump to it?
Yep.
All right. So you might have saw in the headlines that Microsoft was actually partially responsible for seizing 2 different botnet networks, and they actually went in there with briefcases and all kinds of things. Alan, what's this story about?
Yeah, so Microsoft launched Operation B71, which was a raid against the infrastructure of the Zeus botnet, which we've talked about before.
Yeah.
And it's really bad botnet where it's specifically targeting your banking credentials and trying to steal your identity and so on and so on. So it was this week that Microsoft led a coalition raid against a set of command and control servers for the Zeus botnet. And, I specifically phrase it that way because it sounds like, when the US leads a coalition army against another country.
Yeah, it was a coalition of their financial institutions and Microsoft,
not just that,
right?
but yes. So Microsoft was joined by the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, which is basically a cooperation of a bunch of banks to deal with this banking fraud. Because these banks were the ones being targeted by this botnet.
Oh, okay.
Also, the NACHA, which is the National Automated Clearinghouse Association. So they handle electronic payment transfers between banks. And the ABA, the American Bankers Association, and a couple of private companies as well.
Okay.
So Microsoft, with its co-plaintiffs, filed for a temporary restraining order and a seizure order to confiscate the servers for the botnet.
This is an interesting process. So they go through a process where they sort of assemble a case against these people.
Right. And so they filed a case in a district court in New York, naming 39 John Does as the defendants, and presented their evidence, which and basically charging them with things under a slew of different laws. I have actually in the show notes links to all the PDFs of all the legal notices and all the filings. But there's the Computer Abuse Act, the Can Spam Act, the RICO Act, and a bunch of others and there's they lump in everything they can, including trademark infringement, because some of the spam emails that the Zeus botnet uses to try to draw people in include Microsoft logos or NACHA logo, trying to say this is a valid bank transfer.
From the way I read it, and I'm wondering because it sounds like you've done some reading on this too. It sounded like the thing that gave them essentially the avenue that allows them to get a federal search warrant after pleading this case is the RICO Anti-Racketeering Act, right? Is that correct?
So basically, Zeus is believed to be run by organized crime, possibly out of Russia, and so when organized crime is doing business or doing harm to a business, or in this case, a number of businesses, then the RICO Act provides some remedies for that.
And so that was something that was passed in 1970, but I guess it still works for something like this.
Yeah, because again, the RICO Act is specifically about targeting organized crime, and that's what this appears to be.
Yeah.
So the District Court in New York ordered the U.S. Marshals to seize the servers from the two different data centers, one in Chicago, Illinois, and one in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And then also the court ordered that the Marshals be accompanied by Microsoft's lawyers and their forensic experts to assist in identifying which machines to take down and isolating the command and control systems so that parts of the botnet wouldn't remain operational.
Interesting.
The court further ordered that the Marshals collect 4 hours of internet traffic in and out of the command and control servers before they disconnect them.
Oh.
So they hook up a packet sniffer and basically log all of the traffic in and out of these servers for 4 hours before they take them down, and collecting evidence about what's actually happening on these servers, which is kind of a clever idea, actually. I think actually see what's going on there, because if you seize the servers and you have the hard drives or whatever, that's one thing. But in the end, it's it's helpful to be able to see what was happening with these live servers.
Microsoft was pretty proud of this too. On my local the local news here, I'm showing a clip of it in the video version of the show. They ran videos that Microsoft took, showed the guys walking up to the buildings in their briefcases and things like that. My question for you is this, Alan: do you think it's fair, though, that the people who will be going after them in court are the people now also directly involved in this end of the investigation?
It seems a little fishy that the plaintiffs are there as part of collecting the evidence. That the collection of the evidence is supposed to be impartial. Although once the servers are seized, they won't be going to Microsoft. They're going to this third party that was appointed to hold the evidence and so on.
But even in this video and in some statements, they show Microsoft employees hooking up USB, like right here. Yeah. That's a Microsoft employee hooking up drives to copy data off the servers.
Right. But yes, it seems to me the U.S. Marshals should have their own people that know how to do forensics on servers and so on, rather than having to rely on the plaintiff in this case. It's a little fishy, but in this case, it's.
I mean, it seems legit.
It's not a regular civil case so much because it's against organized crime. But yes, the rules should still apply, and Microsoft shouldn't be hands-on as far as collecting the evidence to be used in a case.
That would make me more comfortable.
They're the plaintiff, but
right. Now, this seems to be the brainchild of like one of the new top lawyers at Microsoft, who actually has a bit of a federal investigations background himself. So kind of started, and they're taking this as, I think he even released a statement saying like they're going to bring the fight to him now and stuff like that.
Yep. And the court also ordered that all U.S.-based domain registrars that control some of the 800 domains that Microsoft linked to the botnet will redirect those domains to a specific Microsoft server that was identified in the court order.
Oh, okay.
So all of those domains will point to a Microsoft server, and the servers at the data center will be taken offline. And so I think the idea there is that Microsoft will attempt to identify and disinfect the computers that have this botnet software running on them.
Wow,
as they try to talk to the command and control servers.
That's really. But
also, Microsoft is using this to collect intelligence and try to gain more information about the botnet itself.
We have links in the show notes, and one of these goes to Microsoft's Security Center blog, and they've got some interesting graphs and things that they're showing about where they think some activity is and whatnot. So.
Yeah, so Microsoft's Digital Crimes Unit has its own newsroom page that I linked to, and it shows, they have a bunch of stuff there. In the show notes, I have links to ZeusLegalNotice.com, which has all of the PDFs of all the legal filings.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Including Microsoft's requests, their evidence, the court's rulings, and so on and so on. Also, links to a couple of different sites covering this stuff, including Threat Post and Security Week and so on. And also a link to an interview with one of the lead forensics guys from Microsoft about this takedown, Richard Bozovich, who was there when it happened and was kind of, giving a firsthand account of what they did.
But overall, it sounds like you're fairly comfortable. It seems like it's above board and all that.
Yeah, it's just, it's the first time the RICO Act's been used to seize servers and domain names like that.
And being led by a private company like that. And
yes.
also...
Some of the news made it sound like Microsoft was walking into the data center and seizing the servers.
Right. Well, you know what it was is
the U.S.
because you
Marshals.
can see it in that video. Right. That video doesn't show the U.S. Marshals. So if you are our local news rolled that video.
Right.
They
but
don't even say
it is a little weird to have the plaintiff coming along as part of the seizure like this, but I understand part of it is, this stuff is not just technical, but really highly technical.
Well, and the plaintiff coordinating, not just through the RICO Act, but with the different financial players too, which again, they were, in some way involved, very likely. It's precedent setting,
the Zeus botnet is a lot about defrauding financial institutions, using money mules and getting that money.
It's a new frontier out there, though. Yeah, their lead lawyer guy was quoted as saying that law enforcement is just too slow, and they're not going to wait around anymore.
Well, part of it is that, but the U.S. Marshals only have so many forensic guys, and they were trying to seize this in a certain amount of time, and they also wanted it coordinated. They wanted to take down all the servers at exactly the same time, so the botnet didn't have time to adapt.
Right.
Because if you take out the one server, then if they have backup servers, then the remaining server could tell all the botnet infected drones, this is where the new server is.
You know what the reality is, Alan? The reality is it's all just meant to sell more box copies of Windows, because the Windows platform is being defended by Microsoft, because at the end of the day, they don't make money from this. They make money from selling copies of Windows.
Yeah.
So as long as it is a means to that end, I guess they're happy. All right.
Right, well, but at the same time, it's
less botnets
cleaning up the internet is a good thing.
Yep.
And this goes to show that it's possible to do that without overly broad powers for the government as far as cybersecurity goes.
And there needs to be a solution for the very real fact that those people in those positions in the law positions just often don't have the appropriate technical skills, whereas the private industry does. So if the private industry, those technical cases like that, they probably need to reach out to those experts, because it's not exactly realistic to expect U.S. Marshals to be computer experts. So they gotta work with them.
The U.S. Marshals could hire a few computer experts, but
yeah, I guess you're right about that. All right. Well, before we go on, why don't we stop and say hello to the fine folks over at GoDaddy.com. GoDaddy's been rocking support of TechSNAP for quite a while now, and the month is wrapping up. It's sort of unbelievable that March is almost over, and we did have some March-specific promo codes that were awesome, but I think GoDaddy is in the spring spirit. I tell you what, they are giving this stuff away, Alan. Check it out. We have 2 codes for you this week, and they'll last through April 30th. So use them soon because they do expire. And the first code will give you up to 5 .com domains, 5 .com domains for $5.99, up to 5, each one, $5.99. It's crazy.
That's even
good
better
deal.
than the usual code.
I know. And to use that, use the code 599COM7. 599COM7. Also, we have another code. If you don't want the .coms, if you want something else, and you want to save 15% on your entire order, 15%, use the code SPRING7. Maybe you want to do a little spring domain name cleanup or purchasing or renewing. If you need to do some, that's a great one to use if you need to do some domain name renewals, is SPRING7 to get 15%
that always
off.
happens.
Yeah, I know, right? Off your entire
15%
order.
off works on everything, so that's
it's a good deal.
that means that it'll work on .cas because somebody was asking about that in the chat
But
room.
really, if you're starting up a project and you need to grab a few .coms, or if you've had some ideas for some great domains that you've been sitting on, $5.99COM7 will get you up to 5 domains for $5.99. That's a great deal. Thank you, GoDaddy.com, for supporting TechSNAP and the Jupiter Broadcasting Network. All right, Alan, now we've got a war story coming up. We have got the roundup.
Feedback questions.
And a feedback question. Is there anything else you want to cover before we jump into it?
Nope.
All right, then. It's time for the TechSNAP feedback. Welcome to the TechSNAP feedback. Thank you for sending your emails to techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com. All right, Alan, we've got feedback and we've got a war story. Are you ready, sir, for your first question?
Yes.
All right. Well, it's actually the only question, so I'm glad you're ready. All right, Alan, and it goes like this. This came from, was it, I already... Simon from Australia? Is that what it was?
Yep.
All right, I see it at the bottom. Hi, Chris and Alan. I have a question on DNS zone transfers and what the security implications are. All of my domains in the past have disallowed zone lookups. Example, zone transfers. Example, he does a dig command of how he's, using the dig command to do a transfer. But after moving my DNS to a stock Ubuntu server, it seems to be a default to allow transfer lookups for anyone. I also noticed the default for this is disallowed on Debian 6, since Ubuntu is based on Debian. What I want to know is how important is it to restrict transfer lookups? Should they be allowed to the public, since DNS should be public anyways? If so, then why do so many DNS hosts out there have this disabled by default? Thanks for your time. Regards, Simon. All right, Alan. What do you think?
Okay, so what he's talking about is normally you have you set up a domain like your something.com, and you have a bunch of records like www.something.com or ftp.something.com, or for example with the Jupiter Colony, we have minecraft.jupitercolony.com, which goes to our Minecraft server, and then there's www.jupitercolony.com that goes to the website, and there's one for TeamSpeak, and there's a bunch of different subdomains that all go to different places. Now there are also a few secret ones in there. Back when we had 2 Minecraft servers, there was the public one and the secret one. We don't necessarily want people to be able to find the name of the secret Minecraft server. So anyway, the DNS zone transfer command is there so that with DNS, you almost always have more than one domain server, one DNS server, right? You have bind here and bind somewhere else. So what happens there is the slave servers go to the master server and do a zone transfer and copy all the configuration data to their local hard drive. And then what they do is every so often they pull the master and ask it, what's the serial number of the zone? If it's gone up since the last transfer, it does a new zone transfer and downloads the data over again. So normally, historically, that's always only ever been allowed from a specific list of servers, which by default was empty. So normally no one could do a zone transfer, and then you would specifically allow your slave servers to copy the zone. And normally you would actually have a separate list for each domain, because if you host separate domains, maybe only certain servers should be able to slave that zone. And the main idea here is, you could allow it to everyone, but there are some performance implications, you have to worry about, because zone transfer is always done over TCP rather than UDP. They're a bit slower and they require more resources. So there are possibly a vector for a denial of service attack. But more specifically, it can be an information leak. Right? Like in this case, we have some secret URLs for the Jupiter Colony domain. If someone could do a zone transfer, they would see every record in the domain. So on top of the ones we published, like the TeamSpeak and the Minecraft and the Zatonic server we have now, or Zonotonic or however you pronounce it.
I know, isn't that awesome? That's awesome. We have a Zatonic server now.
There's some other ones, and if you could do a zone transfer, you would see all those, and you would see the names and the IP addresses. A better example is, if you're a private company and you have it set up, but you have like a VPN or internal stuff, you may still have fully qualified domain names for some of your servers, right? Like you might have each machine in your office may have a name, right? Like
maybe
at
like
the
for
college
remote access or something.
Yeah, or well, not just that, but they could just be internal even. So at the college, every machine had a unique host name that identified where in the room it was and what room it was in.
Nice.
Right? There's rows and room numbers and everything.
The
in the
ultimate achievement is when you come up with the perfect naming scheme for a large network.
Well, it's easy to do in classrooms when you have rows. So it's like, this is row 7, seat 4.
Wow. You had it down to the row and seat? Wow, respect.
Yeah, well, because they're just rows of computers, right? So it's like, E1 room E129, row 3, seat 4.
Well, what about like machine swap outs and stuff? You just had to be. Were you diligent about machine names?
I didn't run the stuff.
I see.
But yeah, it was, when you re-image the machine, you would just set its host name to where it was. Yeah. Anyway, all those have internal IPs. So if you do if you could do a zone transfer on this company, you could get the internal IP addresses of all their servers.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you normally wouldn't be able to connect to them. But if you're doing this island hopping attack we've talked about, right? If you manage to compromise the computer of the secretary by sending an infected Excel document to her via email,
it's good recon.
Now her computer is connected to the outside. So you can, if you manage to get into that, or the Excel file you send to her has a remote administration Trojan in it that breaks out of the firewall and allows you to connect to her machine and control it. Now, if you can do that zone transfer, you can find out the IP addresses of every machine in their network, right? Because especially with Windows networks now, the domain is like the Windows Active Directory domain creates DNS records for every machine based on their machine name.
Mm-hmm.
So, you could find out the address of, fileserver.somecompany.com. You would know what its IP address is now, and you would be able to connect to it. So it's not a huge deal, but it's information disclosure. It's like, do you want people to have that information?
And probably not. And
yeah, most likely not.
Yeah.
So the only cases I know of places that specifically allow zone transfers on a regular basis would be something like a DNS blacklist, where they want people to copy it rather than do the lookups directly to them for load balancing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, in general, there's a reason why the default is disallow it. It's not a huge deal to allow it. Especially if your domain consists of, a record to point www, like the root of the domain and www to your web server and maybe an MX record for your email, then there's nothing really being disclosed there. But if you have a bunch of separate subdomains and you have it all set up and your internal network is all mapped out in this zone file, because, that's a nice thing to do. It's like I have that at my house. There's a little internal .nx domain for non-existent.
Yep.
And, I have it all set up so that all my machines are internally addressable.
Yeah.
And, that's extra information that an attacker would find useful. And so you might not allow that.
That's true. Yeah. Well,
basically not a huge deal, but, if there's anything in there you wouldn't want everybody to be able to see, then that's why the default is not to allow.
Yeah, it's probably worth looking into. I didn't know, and I guess I haven't double checked. I didn't know Ubuntu did that by default. I was just going to look it up.
I know that it does, and it seems like, without a very specific reason, it's really kind of weird. So basically, by default, the zone transfer is already off, but they're basically in your bind config, there's a stanza called allow-transfer, and it would normally be empty. And you would normally fill it with a couple of IP addresses or subnets where you want to allow zone transfers from. It seems maybe in Ubuntu, the default is actually to have the word any in there, which is a special wildcard that means any IP address.
All right. Thank you to Simon for sending that question in. All right, Alan, I do believe we have a war story from the other Alan, Irish Dark Shadow, in the chat room. He's in there right now. And he's also one of the suckers one of the nice guys behind the Torx production crew, a key member there too. So we always love reading these war stories, Alan. And this one has me a little nervous because it's titled "When Kids Attack," and I'm a father of 2, so I don't know.
You're afraid your kids are going to attack you?
Well, it's making me worried. I'll provide color commentary as the father perspective here.
Okay.
All right.
So I was just talking about the summer of 1999. He was working tech support during the night at IBM and freelancing during the day. And he says one of the jobs that consistently came up was to teach the basics of Windows networking at some local schools.
Ah, old school.
Yeah. So he wrote up a couple of courses that were little 4-hour sessions that would explain a lot of the basics and get into kind of an overview of everything. So the curriculum he decided upon would start off with an hour of going over what are the components of a PC and how do they work.
Oh, okay.
So everything, talking about how the BIOS gets the machine started up and then it boots the OS and, this is a hard drive and so on.
Oh, I would have loved that as a kid.
Yeah. The next portion covered how to install an operating system and how to add specific software drivers and, all the basic stuff you need to know to make a computer work. The operating system of choice at, 1999 was obviously Windows 98. But despite that, he spent about 40% of the time covering topics about DOS because, that was the best way to solve a problem back then. Right?
Mm-hmm.
When Windows doesn't work, you go down to DOS.
Go down to DOS, right? Oh, the program doesn't run fast enough. Try running under DOS. Yeah.
Yep. I remember on my old 486, I had a couple of games that if you exit Windows and run them, they would run fine. But if you tried to do it in Windows, it would just die.
Right. And then you'd have the problem where your CD-ROM worked under Windows, but the driver didn't load under DOS. So you'd have to make sure it works.
I didn't have that problem because I had the driver for my crazy, ridiculous external SCSI CD-ROM drive.
Oh, yeah.
For DOS.
Yeah.
It's nice, AdaptTech driver and everything. Anyway, so as part of the operating system tour, he would cover a bunch of things like the startup folder and the msconfig utility, which at that time was new. And basically the run keys and the run once keys in the registry, which are, how you set something to run automatically without it appearing in the start menu.
Right.
And run once is, do this next time you reboot and then don't do it after. Yeah. And then, how to create the keys to actually run an application as a service as well, which was important if you were trying to run something as a server, even if it was, it was a Windows 98 machine. But I remember back then it was popular to have things like Wingate or whatever if you had multiple computers on your LAN, but you only had dial-up, then you had to set up a little proxy server in order to allow the other computers to share your dial-up.
The main thing you were trying to accomplish was the ability to have something run in the background without the console being logged in or something like that, So
or having the application, if the application isn't open on your screen, you don't accidentally close it.
There was a Windows Resource Kit utility that would convert a lot of applications into services. And that was actually how we migrated a lot of early systems to Windows NT servers where they didn't run as services. We used that tool, even though it wasn't always approved.
Yep. And so Irish says, by the end of the 4-hour session, his aim was to have students leave with a solid and practical understanding of, what happens inside their PC. Most of the kids were in their mid-teens, and, it was a little challenging to keep their interest as you cover a lot of these topics because a lot of times you find that people think of depending when you grew up, especially the younger kids now, a computer is like a TV. You don't really care how it works inside.
Right.
Whereas when I grew up, I didn't get a PC till later and I wanted to tear it apart and find out what everything did and know everything.
It's interesting, right? Now, of course, we actually have some people in our IRC chat room who I would say, are at the age I was, and they're very interested in computers. But as somebody who worked on and off over the last few years at a school district, over the last 10 years, I will absolutely back you up on that claim. There is a sharply declining interest in actually how computers work, and it's very much like kind of like how I have a very vague understanding of how the microwave works, but beyond that, I don't really care. I kind of feel like
or
that's
even
how
like your television, right?
Yeah, the television.
Well, it's a little different now with the
or radio. Like when radio was new, was the big hobby was people it was a really big fad for people to assemble their own radios.
Yeah. And now it's just a commodity device. And, and that things happen like that. Although I built a little crystal radio when I was a kid.
Yeah, and you even still like Mr. Mango points out. I
had a couple of those Radio Shack 201 type kits.
Like Mr. Mango points out in the chat, you even still have people assembling some cars. So, yeah.
So anyway, during the second session in Irish's little program, he came up with roll out the basics of networking and using real world examples. So he would talking, all right, if this is how the cable works and everybody holds on to it and I plug it into the wall, then everybody gets the signal. and talking to them about the differences between a switch and a hub and a bunch of that stuff.
Very cool.
And there was a big list, but I edited it out.
There you go. There you go. All right.
He had some pretty heavy topics in there, obviously, but that's what you do.
Yeah. Good stuff for kids to learn and kind of get the fundamentals.
Yeah, and using real world examples makes them able to understand it a little better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So he ran this course this way for quite a few months, but at one point he was asked to make a more advanced version. So some of the students that had taken his were interested in learning even more. So
good sign.
A follow up for the more interested students. So he did maybe 3 or 4 of these follow up sessions, and he was quite happy with the depth of questions. Right, that's how you can tell how interested people are when you're teaching something.
Right.
Is do the questions they ask make any sense?
Right.
Or are they going? Are they
taking what you gave them and taking it to the next question point?
Or are they asking about what's on the next slide when you're not quite there?
Right.
Are they thinking ahead and making that connection that you're trying to get them to make?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So sometime later, maybe around November of that year, he got a panicked call from the school principal saying that apparently every computer in their lab was going crazy.
Uh-oh.
So none of the students were able to help, and the IT teacher, who is actually a carpenter who did work around the college, only had some basic computer skills, and so couldn't figure out what the problem was. So he drove over before work and took a look to see what was going on. So upon his arrival, he noticed that every PC, when turned on, would go through the post process, boot up Windows 98, get the desktop up, and the icons would load, and then it would instantly shut down again.
All right, somebody's fooling with something.
Yeah. So he started to see why they thought their computers were now possessed by some vengeful spirit of a mailman who got lost in a maze of network circuits.
I would immediately start thinking over my students and being like, which one of those is a little punk?
Yeah. So unfortunately, the solution was a little more mundane. So once he got one of the machines to boot into safe mode, he could start to pull apart what was happening. So basically, it looks like someone had installed the Windows Resource Kit on every computer.
Oh, yeah.
And we included, the shutdown application.
Right.
So it's actually included standard in later versions of Windows as well.
Right.
So there's a little tool called Shutdown, and you can connect to it over the network if you have the administrator password for the local machine, or if you have a domain account, then you can actually cause the computer to shut down.
Have you ever,
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
It was part of our the Microsoft admin class to teach people how to do this.
Yeah.
It's actually something. It's actually used at the college to turn off the 2,000 computers in the college at 11 p.m. every night.
So I one of the last gigs before I was done contracting, went full time with Jupiter Broadcasting. The previous admin, they'd suffered a lot of power failures, and they had server rooms in 3 separate buildings. And he created a master batch file that when one server room began to have power issues, he made the assumption that all of the server rooms would be having power issues, which was very much not the case. Mm-hmm. And he automated, using that shutdown command, the complete and total shutdown of 40 servers and about 110 workstations. And one day during the day, one of the buildings lost power, and that script kicked off. And he didn't have it documented anywhere. And that script kicked off and shut everybody down.
And it was like, why did all of our computers just shut off?
Yeah, it's like, so it's picture me. Here I am, coats on. I got my keys. I'm getting in my truck. It's raining. I just sit down in my truck. I go to turn it on to drive to lunch. My phone starts ringing like crazy. And I'm just like, no. So that shutdown script can be used very incorrectly. All right.
Right. So the culprit had basically created a batch file that called the shutdown command, and also re-added that batch file. So there's a batch file that called the shutdown command with all the parameters.
Yeah.
And then there was another batch file in the Windows directory that would call that.
Oh my gosh.
So basically in a run once registry key, they created a hidden batch file that would call the shutdown process and re-add itself to the run once key. It's basically the run once registry key was created when it called the hidden batch file, which would then trigger a shutdown. And so it wouldn't show up under the regular run key. It would when the run once triggered, it would re-add itself to run once and call the shutdown, making it even harder to detect.
Right.
So the end result of this mess was, the Windows machine would boot up and then, load everything up, fire off all these run scripts, and then the shutdown command would re-add itself to the registry and shut the computer off. And it would boot up and it would continue this process.
Oh my goodness. One of these kids did this, didn't they?
Yeah. So during, he did a bit more digging and found yet another batch file that made some other changes to the registry. And basically,
really?
So even if one of the two batch files was disabled, the other one would make sure that the script kept running.
Very clever. Very clever.
Yep. So he tried to explain the whole thing to the principal, and he struggled to understand it, but he grasped the concept that it was a well thought out act of IT sabotage.
Yeah.
But it was Windows 98, so each computer used the same generic login, or Windows 98 didn't really have logins.
Right.
You had like a username that you could prompt for that didn't mean anything.
Can I tell you a funny story?
Yeah.
So when I was a student, we had some early versions of Windows networking too, and it was student login was the username, and like students with an S was the password, right?
Yep.
Well, one day I took a photo of the year. I got access to the yearbook photos because I think I was working with them for something, and I think I was helping them with a website, actually, early photo book website, and I had a picture of the principal and a picture of one of the teachers that I didn't like, a female, and I photoshopped the male principal head onto this teacher, and then I found the image that they set for all of the student accounts login through that old ntpol.data, the old group policy.
Yep.
And I replaced the file because it was writable to my account with this Photoshop so when all of the students logged in the next day throughout the school, the principal Photoshop job that I did was the background for all of the computers, and the principal was livid. He hunted the teacher down, and the teacher, who is a friend to this day, actually, all these years later, didn't give me up. He took the heat for me, and he said, I'll look into who it was, but he totally knew it was me.
Yep.
Which is good, because then I went later to work for that district, and I probably wouldn't have got a job if he had given me up.
Yeah.
All right, continuing on.
I have similar stories from high school. So each, and I remember at the college, every machine had the same password, but the username was the machine name, or a variant of it.
Okay.
So that, again, on the network, they could identify which machine was the problem.
Right. It's a good idea.
So unless the IT teacher was an Oscar-winning actor, I was pretty sure that it wasn't that guy. And also, the teacher has less motivation to do this.
Yeah.
So the only thing Irish could think of was that it was a student that, and so he started to suspect that it might have been one of the ones that he had trained. Because,
he did cover the run once registry stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the attack showed a good grasp of batch files and the Windows startup process, but he had never actually covered batch files or how to create registry keys from a batch file in his class.
Mm-hmm.
But, once you give people the seed, the whole point is that they go and expand themselves.
Right.
So whoever had wrecked the Windows 98 on about 70 or so computers had, done some research on their own and added to that knowledge.
It's funny too, because what it really kind of shows is that Irish was a pretty good teacher. Of course, That's not how the administration, I'm sure, looked at it.
So Irish figured that it would take, about 4 or 5 minutes on each PC to get all 70 computers sorted out. But it was more likely that somebody had, spent 6 or 7 out. Well, to basically to apply this to each of the machines, it would have taken that amount of time as well.
Yeah.
So somebody must have spent, 6 or 7 hours in this lab breaking each of these machines.
Right.
So everything was fine at the end of the previous school day, so it had to have been that night.
Aha.
So from there, we spoke to some teachers who ran the after-hour classes, and it didn't take long to find a student who was supposed to be in the library until up to like 10 p.m. or something. And so the last teacher leaving said that the student had hung around since the 3 p.m. When classes ended, and supposedly working on an end-of-term project.
And did she mention, I noticed he moved from computer to computer?
I don't know. When the principal brought the student to the IT room, and Irish was taken aback that it was in fact one of the students that had taken his basic class, but who had seemed disinterested and didn't take the advanced class.
Interesting.
Yes.
Huh. Well,
maybe it just took a little longer to sink in.
Yeah, exactly.
So after some conversation, it turned out the student had sabotaged the PCs because his math teacher had given them a ton of homework.
Oh, you're kidding me.
And he had wanted to take a girl to see the last screening of Star Wars Episode 1.
Well, okay. I mean, let's face it. These are some pretty good reasons, actually, when you think about it. I mean, if you have means, it's...
So Irish managed to get more information about how he carried out the attack. And basically, it was a combination of the DOS training that Irish had given him with some Windows lessons from speaking to the father of one of his friends who was working at Microsoft doing localizations into like converting Windows into, well, Irish.
I just wonder why, if it took him 6 hours or so roughly to do all of this on the machines, he could have just spent that time working on his math homework. Just
Probably,
saying.
yes. But that doesn't make the point.
Not as much fun. I'll grant you that.
I remember, the advantage of tools like Beyond Exec and being able to do all the computers from one machine. Is actually when I used to run LAN parties at the college, and I basically had a little USB stick I wrote with a bunch of scripts. I'd sit down on one machine, plug this in, and I'd be like, all right, exit the virus scanner on all 50 computers. Done.
Yes.
Copy this file to all 50 computers.
Yeah.
And I wrote my own installer scripts for like the demos of Soldat and Unreal Tournament 2004 and Trackmania.
Yeah.
And it would basically push them out and install them on all the computers at once. And it's like, sitting here, one machine commanding all of them. It's like, it would have taken 6 hours to set this up on each individual computer.
Yeah.
But I did it in 15 minutes by sitting at one and using the network.
Yep. I
that's
love
the advantage
doing
to
stuff
something
like
closer to, when you have Windows XP or better, you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, the Microsoft guy taught the student to use the DOS commands and the batch files to actually interact with the registry. And thus, a hacker was born. So the principal suspended the student, and that was pretty much the end of it.
Oh, okay.
So he detailed how to fix the problem and left the work for the IT teacher and his backup, who happened to be that maths teacher. So in a small way, Irish helped the kid to punish the math teacher.
So there's some justice in the story there. Okay.
Yep. So Irish doesn't really know too much about how the student progressed after that. But he did actually end up running into him a number of years later at a Windows 2008 server industry-only event in Dublin, run by Microsoft. And basically, he was running IT security for the event itself as part of his role with Microsoft.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, boy. Oh, man, does Microsoft have a team for those events? And it is stressful.
But, and maybe, part of this may have been because he had that connection with somebody that already worked at Microsoft. But, so it turns out his skills got him a job. So, and Irish says, from little acorns, large oak trees are born. So Irish never decided whether the kid turned to the dark side from being denied his view of Star Wars on the big screen or from not getting that girl to go there with him. But either way, rage leads to anger, anger leads to revenge, and revenge leads to a nice paycheck.
Hey, there you go.
So he says, maybe there's a nugget of wisdom in that somewhere. Probably not, since it sounds like a contrived crap. But I just like how this kid took some basic IT lessons, found the tool set, expanded on it, and did something and managed to get himself a job.
That's always the best sign when somebody does that, because it's such a huge subject matter to get into that you have to have the passion to just dig into it on your own time. And
I'm gonna have to tell the war story about my adventures in high school with the computer labs.
All right,
I'll do that some other time.
That I've got a couple myself. I spent some time in computer labs over the years. All right, Alan. Well, thank you to the other. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, the fun part was tricking the school into giving me access and wanting me to do it. That's what makes it a good war story.
I will have to tell the one about when I tried installing a couple of modems into the computer lab to set up myself a free ISP through the school.
That'll be a good one.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you to the other Alan for sending in that war story. You can also send your war stories to TechSNAP at JupiterBroadcasting.com. But now, with the feedback done and the war story all wrapped up, it's time for the TechSNAP Roundup. Welcome to the TechSNAP Roundup. Yeah, that's what that crazy music means. Now, the Roundup are stories that didn't quite make it into the top of the show, but are still quite interesting that we wanted to cover, maybe follow up on, and just provide you with a link so you can do a little further reading on your own. Alan, are you ready to tear through the Roundup? We try to move a little faster, too. And thank you to everybody over at links.techsnap.tv, the official subreddit of TechSNAP, for submitting and voting on stories. Often, many of the Roundup stories come from that subreddit. All right, Alan, our first story on the show is, can cops crack an iPhone in under 2 minutes?
Yes, they can.
They actually can, and there was video proof of it too.
Yeah, it's basically a defense contractor has come up with a series of tools that exploit some flaws in the iPhone and apparently also Android, although the Android one's not quite as fast, to brute force the PIN and unlock the phone.
Now, actually, these tools have been around for a little while. I heard about them back in December. I heard about a story like this.
And basically, they're selling very quickly to the military.
So what is it like? Are they pulling people over for like traffic stops and then grabbing their phone is it like for investigations, or what are we talking about?
I think it's more along the line of investigations and so on.
All right.
Or the military may actually be captured. Although I don't expect that in some of the places where the military's deployed and capturing people in their phones, I doubt they have an iPhone. But
right, it says it's designed to dump GPS locations, web history, calls, contacts, even keystroke logs if they're available. That
sounds like I was using that
Carrier
software
IQ.
we talked about, Carrier IQ software.
Yeah.
So basically, when the police seize a phone, they usually have an issue where they can't actually unlock the phone to get the data without having to force the suspect to give up the PIN number. So this tool allows them to brute force the PIN number, gain access to the phone, and get all that information. It's basically a tool that helps them do the forensic analysis of the phone. Right, getting that GPS history that. Remember, we also talked about that. Most people don't know that their iPhone was saving their GPS history of everywhere they've been to a file on the iPhone.
Right, and which has been like reduced, but it's still like 30 days. It's still like a 30-day log or something like that, right? Yeah. It's like a cache of some kind. So.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like you mentioned, like you just said, they're selling this to the U.S. military as well. So I'm sure the use of these devices is only going to continue to expand. I guess that's all we have to say on that. Should we talk about this EFF story and the two cybersecurity bills that are kind of moving forward, right? And the EFF is essentially behind one of them more than the other?
Not really. They don't like either, but they're, they're like, with some certain changes, they wouldn't be so bad.
Wow.
So basically, the EFS is cautioning that the two new cybersecurity bills have sweeping changes and basically are too broad. They don't define exactly what they're doing enough. Or what's allowed enough, so that it would basically be an open door for the government or corporations to abuse them. So basically, they don't really define what a cyber attack is. So it could be anything from a port scan to denial of service, or even just using encryption could be considered a cyber attack.
I guess. See, the thing is they're already defining port scans and those kinds of things as a cyber attack. They've already claimed they are. So it seems like they've already decided those count.
But basically, they say anything that interferes with their ability to monitor or control anything. So if you're using encryption and that stops them from diverting, spying, or shaping your traffic, then you're interfering with their control of the internet, and that's cyber attack.
On the EFF, or this is on threatpost.com, but it's kind of kicked off from what the EFF wrote. They say all three bills seek to facilitate cooperation among branches of the U.S. government and between the government and the private sector. We've talked about that a little bit last week, where they want to share threat information and things like that between all of them.
But also what they're doing here, both of these laws would basically exempt ISPs from the Wiretapping Act and basically compel them to wiretap everything you do.
Right. In fact, it's just like they were doing with SOPA, where if they comply, they are not liable. And if they don't comply, they don't provide the information, they are liable for certain things. And it's sort of...
in this case, it's basically exempting ISPs from the Wiretapping Act.
Now, this article says there's 3 different bills, but I know of one in the House and one in the Senate.
The 2, and the third one they're referring to is SOPA.
Oh, okay. So Interesting. So McCain is introducing one of them, right?
And the other one is Joseph Lieberman.
Lieberman and Rockefeller are introducing the other one. And it just like with SOPA, they're introduced around the same time, PIPA and SOPA. Remember that? Yep. Remember how we did that? Well, now we're doing it all over again, only it's different. It's different this time. It's
Yeah, and the EFF basically says they would like to see a better balance of the public interest rather than these bills focusing on the government's ability to control the internet.
You know, I've been monitoring a lot of this in prep for the new show Unfiltered, because there's some of these topics I might cover in there. And they're on C-SPAN, which is pretty boring, but you can check it out. They are beating the drum over funding right now for a new... there is a cybersecurity division led by the Air Force that has 13,000 members in it. The cybersecurity division has 13,000 members. And guess what? It's time for 2013 planning for budgets. And so I don't think it's any coincidence that these stories are coming out now.
Yeah,
and these efforts are underway.
Yeah, you know, boogeyman tactics to get more money. It's rather typical.
Right.
And you know, I'm not necessarily against spending money on cybersecurity, but again, the point of the cybersecurity should be to protect the public interest, not to give the government more control over the internet.
Well, and I believe that article pointed out like a few obvious things that they are not doing, that if they were truly interested in genuine security, they'd be talking about, and instead they're using these obscure sort of vague references and cooperation, information sharing. They're not actually...
And, you know, when the EFF says, we'd like you to be a lot more specific about what's allowed and what's not and so on, and the people are saying, well, that would, you know, limit the lifespan of the law. And it's like, well, yes, but it's a good thing when the government has to review the law and update it on a regular basis, rather than making one law that sticks for 50 years and basically gives the government unlimited power.
There's vague wording in there about monitoring as well, because you have to be able to determine some of the stuff. And the only way to do it is to log. Probably just a coincidence that one of the top stories in the TechSNAP subreddit this week is also the White House is putting out requests for proposals on how to handle big data. Remember how we've talked about big data before? Government talking about doing these kinds of monitoring and watching this kind of stuff, and at the same time looking for solutions to big data. The two things may be related, they may not be, but it's definitely something that can keep watching, and I would say have a healthy dose of skepticism.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, why don't we move on to this next story? ISPs signal support for an anti-bot code of conduct. What do you think of this?
So it's basically an anti-botnet code of conduct. So the FCC has come up with a set of rules on how ISPs should deal with the fact that their customers are infected by bots.
Something that is sort of a touchy area, because the bots are on machines that are essentially property of their customers, so they can't really like reach out and do something, but at the same time, maybe they could do some sort of network level filtering.
And basically, you know, those bots are then used to attack things, to send spam, to generally degrade the internet, and you know, they're also doing harm to those customers.
Right.
And so, you know, at the same time, you're not wanting to be spying on your customers, and you don't want to be, you know, alarming your customers by saying, hey, you know, we were looking at your computer and it's infected. At the same time, you know, they need to handle it. But basically, you know, if you're a company that does like hosting and so on, and you're getting attacked by these bots, and they're all run by the consumer ISPs like Verizon and Comcast and so on, it's like, you know, this denial of service attack wouldn't be happening if Comcast was blocking it on their side instead of me having to do it on my side.
Everybody just gets a little nervous when you talk about ISPs filtering things, but in this case, it seems to be the appropriate solution is to lock it down at the local level.
But basically, you know, this is basically an optional set of code of conduct, is how they should handle things and how to facilitate communications between the ISPs to solve the problem as quickly as possible.
I mean, it just seems to make sense that you would want to reduce the impact as much, so you need to block it as close to the source as possible.
Exactly.
So, I mean, I don't like the idea of the ISPs just being able to arbitrarily block stuff, but at the same time, keep the networks clutter-free as possible, so that way the legitimate traffic has room to breathe. This next story kind of fits in here. When I think of like somebody getting infected through a website, I think of like somebody using Internet Explorer and going to a site and downloading some sort of file and running it, but this story is actually one of the first times I've ever heard of a fileless bot. Can you tell me about it?
Yes. So basically, it's a bit of malware that was being distributed mostly on a Russian news site. Basically, it was an ad published on an ad network used on this site and a bunch of other Russian language sites would exploit a vulnerability in the browser. And I think the vulnerability was actually in Java, and would infect the computer with a virus. but the virus was never written to disk. It existed only in RAM.
Huh.
And so once the computer rebooted, it went away. But again, the idea was you could just reinfect the computer, right?
Sure.
And but basically, yeah, it was.
It would make sense
really
too, 'cause
hard
if you just
to
infected like an active site where they had a lot of visitors, you could just use the visitors until they rebooted, and as long as there was enough churn.
Yeah, if it's a news site, people normally come back every day or every couple hours, even.
Or a porn site.
Yeah, but basically, what it means here is that they were. It was really hard to detect this infection because most virus scanners and so on scan your hard drive, but there are no files here. There's no fingerprint that this machine has become infected.
Interesting.
Basically, it was a memory resident virus, and it was kind of fairly unique and an interesting trend, which we may see a lot more of.
And I guarantee you, because it's fileless, at some point it'll be called a cloud virus. A virus of the cloud. You just wait and see, Alan. It's coming.
That's the wrong definition of cloud, but
am I wrong? Am I wrong? You come on, these people do this crap all the time.
Yes, but the cloud would mean that the virus had a file. The file just wasn't on your computer. It was in the cloud.
Right, I understand.
In this case, there is no file, but it's just in RAM.
I tell you, you just wait. I wish we had a little prediction book. I predict that's what it'll be called. It'll be called the cloud virus or something stupid.
And I predict I will rail against that very heavily.
And we'll laugh at them when they do it. All right, well, this seems like it could be a good story for consumers. The FTC wants internet companies to use a do not track system. And they have like a picture here of apps. I think
it's actually Google and a couple other places that actually came up with this idea. But I think it was also Mozilla that was behind it. But basically, it'd be a setting, I think, mostly in your browser that would say, as part of your request to the website, I do not wish to have my personal information tracked. So basically, it would mean that you could have session cookies, but once you leave the site, they were not allowed to connect your separate, distinct sessions. So you still have cookies, and you would still use the site normally, but when you leave the site and then come back later, you wouldn't be connected to your previous session.
Sounds like you'd have to log in every time you visit the site.
Not exactly. Like basically, it's a hybrid to solve that problem.
Okay.
Right. So if you use like a private browsing mode and clear your cookies every hour or whatever, then you lose that ability to save settings.
Sure.
So basically, what this is saying is you're allowed to use a cookie to keep track of my logged in status, but you can't track my identity between sessions.
Oh, I see. So they're making
it's basically an extra header in the request that says, please don't invade my privacy.
Right. Right.
Or I don't wish to be tracked. But, sometimes you want to be tracked. Like, I have the Google tracking cookie, and I use that because it actually improves my search results, and it means I get much more meaningful advertisements. Like, I see advertisements for server providers and parts and stuff like that, instead of, seeing silly ads for, like, weight loss. And it's like, I have no interest in that.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I really don't get freaked out about that kind of tracking.
Mostly, I kind of get a good feeling when I see an ad that's for something I might actually want.
Yeah, I follow you.
It's like, why am I seeing that? That's just annoying.
Yeah, I mean, I really don't get bothered by that kind of tracking. It's part of monetizing the web. And Google, I think, just looks at it, the technology is capable of it. I hope everybody's just a number in a database, I hope.
Exactly.
Let's talk about this story, though. This next story has the subreddit all riled up. The users of Live Messenger have recently noticed that Microsoft is censoring Pirate Bay links inside IM sessions. What do you think about this, Alex?
So basically, Microsoft contains a giant blacklist of links and so on. Originally, the idea here was to stop a lot of viruses are distributed by MSN, right? Social engineering.
Yeah.
If your friend sends you a link, you're probably more likely to click on it than if some random person does. So the idea is you seed it up, you get a couple of people to run the virus. They then spam all their friends on their MSN list saying, hey, look at this or whatever. And it spreads via the social network.
Yeah.
And, I've seen some really goofy ones. It's like, oh, look at this picture of so-and-so drunk on Facebook or whatever.
Yep.
It's like, yeah, that link doesn't go to Facebook.
Mm-hmm. I always am worried. Actually, MSN seems to be a really common vector for that stuff.
Well,
I have, like when I had clients that were on MSN, I was always worried about it. AIM? I don't know. It doesn't seem to be as much, but it still happens.
And so they have a blacklist they use to block things like that. And, for whatever reason, they've added the Pirate Bay to that list.
Right.
So one of the interesting things this exposes, and most people don't know, unlike most other instant messenger systems, with Microsoft's MSN, you're never making a direct connection between you and the person you're talking to. Every connection is always routed through a Microsoft server. Part of this is to solve the problem that 90% of the people on the internet are behind a NAT router.
And it allows for like some fancy, I think wasn't MSN one of the first ones that did like, besides Skype, that would forward you all your messages when you were offline, and you could do like doing
stuff like that.
Yeah.
Was to be able to send a message when the person was offline and it would be delivered when they came online.
Yeah.
But basically, it solves the problem of normally if both parties are behind NAT, they can't connect to each other to actually establish a direct connection. Now, Skype solves this with a system of what they call supernodes. And the idea here is that someone that does have the ports open will mediate the connection and get it started.
Right.
In this case, Microsoft provides the central servers for this instead of having to rely on other people in the P2P network. But it also means that basically Microsoft can read and censor every message sent back and forth between the clients. Now, there are alternate clients like Pigeon and so on for MSN. And I don't know, but I think there's also a plugin for MSN that provide what's called off-the-record mode, which basically establishes an encryption between you and the other person and makes it so that the message going back and forth wouldn't be readable to Microsoft or
I think
wouldn't go through their censoring.
It's a bit backwards from a lot of common conceptions. Like Apple recently with iOS 5 introduced this new chat system called iMessage, which lets you chat with one session between all of your iDevices and the desktop. And all of these are direct. Once you've established the connection through their service, they go direct to direct. And when Microsoft rolls out a service, it's just it's two different approaches, and I much prefer the Apple approach in this scenario. I realize there's advantages the way Microsoft does it.
The reason that Skype's built the way it is because they didn't have the money and didn't want to support having all these servers to do it.
Right.
And especially first starting out.
Microsoft could afford the infrastructure, so they took a different route.
And that also meant that, especially when MSN and NAT was popular and MSN was first starting up compared to other services, file transfers always worked with MSN. They were slower because they went through a Microsoft server, but they always worked.
Right.
With things like ICQ or whatever, or AIM, if both parties are behind NAT, nobody could connect to anybody and you wouldn't be able to do a file transfer.
Yeah, it's very true. Well, that's an interesting story, and it makes you just kind of reflect a little bit now that Microsoft owns Skype, because you never know where that's going to go.
But yeah, and so if they change the Skype architecture so that it went through a central server, they would be able to censor it. But I
don't think they're going to. I would hope not.
No. And as importantly, Skype has the ability to make a direct connection, which is like you and I are using a direct connection right now.
Right.
We specifically avoid ever having that relay because like we check every time we start this call, and if we end up with a relay, we reboot Skype and make it force that direct connection, because when you're connected through other people, you sometimes that person will sign off of Skype and your call gets interrupted randomly. But most importantly, we get better speed if we're just directly connected.
Why don't we talk about this story, Alan? Because we need to get the word out there. People need to prepare. They need to download all of Wikipedia, back up your regular website, save everything to cache, because Anonymous is going to take down the internet this weekend. According to basically all of the news sites that I now have put on my disappointed in you list. I couldn't believe how many news sites are running this story without any really updates or addendums. But you remember a while back, Alan, I think we even talked about it. Somebody claiming to be anonymous said that they were going to run a denial of service attack against the root DNS servers and essentially make it look like the internet was down.
So yes, if there are the DNS infrastructure is based on, there's some root servers. There are 13 different authorities that run the root servers. And they don't all run the same software or anything. It's specifically set up differently on each one so that there wouldn't be commonalities as far as attack vectors and so on.
Clever.
And basically, they run most people don't know, but when you have a domain name, there's an invisible dot at the very end. And there's a zone actually called just period that is where all the root of the DNS is. So basically, all this contains is a list of references to other DNS servers. So it has an entry for .com, right? So everything that ends in .com gets referred to this list of servers, right? Which is run by VeriSign. Or, everything for .ca gets listed this set of servers at the CIRA, the Canadian Internet Domain Registry. And, there's one for every country and, every top-level domain. So the .com or the root DNS servers host that and only that. They also host the reverse DNS records for doing an IP address to a host name. And so basically, when you're using the internet, you never actually talk directly to the root domain servers. You ask either something like Google DNS or OpenDNS or your ISP, where is www.google.com?
Right.
And so what happens there is, if nothing else existed on the internet right then, what would happen is your ISP server would go out to the root domain server and say, where is the server for .com? And the root server would say, it's over here at VeriSign, right? And then your ISP's DNS server would say, it would go to those .com servers and say, where are the servers for Google or google.com? And VeriSign would say, Google, give us this list of servers. So you would then go and ask the Google server, what IP address is www.google.com? And Google will give you an answer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how DNS works. And what happens there, though, is each of those records has a cache time. So, for example, I think on the root DNS servers, the cache for .com is like 7 days. So once your ISP looks up where the .com servers are, they keep that on their like a copy, so they don't have to look up and don't call the root servers again for a week. So basically, everyone at Comcast only has to call the root DNS server for .com once a week.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So then people who are using their Comcast DNS settings are then sort of using probably when they look something up, it's a cached record. Exactly.
Especially if it's something popular like Facebook or whatever, then it skips all of the steps because it already knows the answer.
Right.
But if you look up, if you're the first person at Comcast in a week to go to jupiterbroadcasting.com, it already has the record for .com cache. It just
that would
has
be a bad week for us.
Yeah. But it just it would only have to do the one level there instead of all the complete recursion.
Mm-hmm.
So even if the root DNS server went down, which is all 13 authorities, which is made up of hundreds of servers. I think you even have a map of where they are.
Yeah, because they're spread out over, they have essentially CDNs for these guys, right?
Basically. And so most people are under the misconception that there were only 13 root
actual
DNS
servers. Right.
And, that was true in like the 80s.
Right.
But basically since then, those servers have basically become clusters and they don't all exist in the same place. Yeah, originally, yes, most of them were also concentrated in the USA. But now, definitely not so much.
Right. No, I'd say there's more outside the U.S.
So, like one of the 13 authorities is ICANN. They run 85 different DNS servers under the same name, l.root-servers.net or .org, and they're spread all over the world.
Iceland's even got one.
Yeah. And, Canada's got a bunch, and everybody has some.
Hawaii has one. That makes sense.
And basically, the other thing is there's only 13 IP addresses, but each of those uses a technique called Anycast, which we've talked about on the home server segment about a couple of months ago now.
Yeah.
And basically what it means is you connect to the closest one. So
if 12 of them could be down, but if the one closest to you is up.
Well, no, you select one of the 13, and then you get to the closest version of that one. And if that doesn't respond, then you try one of the different 13 and you get the closest version of that one.
Right.
But you don't actually connect to your ISP would.
Right. I was going to ask you, so if I'm Comcast user using Comcast DNS,
then you would never ever talk to the root DNS server.
Root DNS could be down for a week before potentially I would notice.
Yeah. Until the Comcast cache went out.
Yeah.
Then, the chances of that happening are pretty low.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This is why I think all of the news sites, and it's like all of them, ZDNet and a bunch of them, are running the story without any of this info in there.
Yes, and it's quite obvious that, especially with the date they picked, that this is an April Fool's joke. Right? They're like, on midnight on April Fool's Day, we're going to shut down the whole internet. And then on April Fool's Day, it'll be like, ha, fooled you.
Dude.
Scared the pants off everybody by saying we were going to do something that's not possible.
This is silly. They call it, they have a name for it too. What do they call it? Do you remember?
Operation Global Blackout or something like that.
Yeah, Global Blackout 2012. That's right.
And it's, this is the someone attempting to take out the root DNS servers is such a popular topic. There's an entire Wikipedia page dedicated to why it's not possible.
Yeah, yeah. And also, by the way, some anonymous accounts have tweeted and said, this is, I don't think we could ever do this. I don't think this would be.
No one can. That's the whole point.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I love this Wikipedia article.
The part of the point of Anycast is that if a denial of service attack starts up like that, so say, there's 10,000 people on Comcast that use that low orbit ion cannon or whatever, basically run the anonymous distributed denial of service attack tool and try to attack the root DNS servers directly. Then a Comcast can start blocking their clients from connecting directly to the root servers to stop that. But besides that, it would take out the node closest to Comcast. Because remember, it's not physically closest, it's topologically closest.
Right.
It's based on the internet routing.
Yeah.
But basically, the attack would end up concentrated on the server closest to the source of the attack.
Yeah.
So even if it's distributed, even if it's distributed and they can come up with like 100 gigabits a second of attack traffic, it'll be spread out between hundreds of these DNS servers, and each one would just be like, that's not enough to bother me.
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah, that's a great point too, because I mean, the literal manpower, the bodies and machines they would have to accomplish this, they'd have to saturate essentially.
And not just that, when you're attacking a normal target, you have the advantage that they're not expecting it. Or that they're not sitting there monitoring it 24/7.
Right. Whereas these guys have architected.
Their job is to sit there all day, every day, and make sure it works. Right.
It's the elite geeks going up against the elite geeks. Although I think the whole story's bogus.
Yes, but basically, there's lots of people have tried before, and no one has ever taken out the root DNS.
Right.
Because they have backup plans, and they could just isolate certain areas. Even you could never take it out for the whole internet,
right?
Because no matter how much traffic you could generate, you probably couldn't take out the one in Hawaii. Or because if you're attacking the one in Hawaii from outside of Hawaii, you could saturate the links.
Yeah, you could have a bottleneck of the link to Hawaii.
Yeah, but people in Hawaii would still have access to the root DNS server. So you could never, even if they managed to attack it and actually cause huge outages, they wouldn't be able to turn it off for everyone.
Yeah.
Because some people would be closer to that server than the attackers, and they would gain the advantage.
Huh. Yeah. This is going to be a total non-event.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to see if they actually manage to put a dent in the graphs at the... If you actually go to root-servers.org, they have a post about from summer of last year when they actually found some anomalous traffic. There was a certain domain name that was being queried directly to the root DNS server on a massive scale from China.
Oh yeah, I recall that story.
Actually, they don't think it was actually an attack; it was like a misconfiguration or something.
Yeah.
But basically, because the traffic was all coming from one major ISP in China, it was all routed to one specific. The way the Anycast works, it's per autonomous system. All the traffic went to one specific server at RIPE, which is the European Internet IP Authority. And they run a bunch of the DNS servers in Europe. And basically, their load balancing, because all the traffic was coming from one specific ISP, rather than distributed across the internet like normal, it kind of concentrated on one specific server. And, they're like, well, we were already planning some upgrades, but we've now scheduled those further up, and we're going to add even more capacity so that, even though our regular load is like 3% of what we can handle, we want to make sure that we can always handle a sudden influx of traffic.
So a quick news.google search of Operation Global Blackout 2012 reveals 32 news stories that have been written in just the last 24 hours about this topic. And, I go back to the original story. I did a lot of digging, and I found the original story. And guess where most of the quotes came from?
Right.
The head of the NSA. And I'm telling you, it's got to be related to this budget stuff. It's got to be. This is nothing. This is hype.
Yeah.
I say it's busted. We busted it right here on TechSNAP.
Yes.
Operation Global Blackout is busted.
Yeah. On top of the fact that it will probably never materialize, as in no one will even try. Even if they try, it will be, nothing more than some nice graphs to talk about on the next TechSNAP.
Yeah.
It's like the root-servers.org will publish some nice graphs saying, "Oh, look at they tried, they made a little squiggly line in our graph."
Right. Yeah. I mean, just the way all of these different sites are covering this without posting the addendums and also just the tweets themselves from Anonymous Who said they wouldn't be able to pull this off themselves? It's so crap.
Because it's like the naivete to think that you can take out the internet.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hopefully they never figure it out and they keep trying. I mean, the government. Well, Ellen, dude, I think that's the whole show. It's a big show. Big show.
Big show.
Anything else you want to cover before we run?
Nope.
All right. Well, I just want to let folks know that TechSNAP is released late Thursday nights, early Friday mornings over at jupiterbroadcasting.com, where you can find RSS feeds you could subscribe to, as well as iTunes link if you want to throw it on your iPod or your iPaddle or whatever you want. In fact, we have a large version of this video, of the show, and of course HD and mobile too, but the large is specifically encoded to fit on tablets. It doesn't take up too much space. It's got a good resolution for tablet screens, so if you watch this kind of stuff on there, use that link. And you can also find audio-only versions of the show as well. Mm-hmm. And we're also live over at jblive.tv Thursdays at 1 p.m. Pacific, which is
4 p.m. Eastern, or I think it's 2100 UTC again, because now Europe has finally had their daylight savings time.
Right.
Very confusing.
I know. I was getting some crap for it.
It's still 2000 UTC, but if you live in Britain or if you live where GMT is, remember that you're on summertime now, so you're actually 1 hour ahead of GMT. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So still 2000 UTC.
And you know what? I should give a special mention. I don't know if people will get to see this in time, but definitely catch the April 1st edition of the Linux Action Show. It's going to be live at 10 a.m. on Sunday, 10 a.m. Pacific at jblive.tv. We've got a real special episode planned, and it's going to be one that fans of the network will not want to miss. All right, everyone. Well, Alan, great show. Thank you, sir.
Yep.
And thank you to everyone for tuning into this week's episode of TechSNAP, and we'll see you right back here next week.